Hello, today we will be going over my alternative assignment for the class Youth Criminalization, uh, Sociology 2501 for the course code um, for Mount Allison University. And essentially, an overview of the assignment that I've structured into a PowerPoint is I will be going over the first two units in the textbook for the course, which is Youth Justice Critical Readings. And then within that, I've broken it down into the 18th and 19th century, which we will be looking at how the different ways people described children and how they categorized youth changed over time, as well as a case study to go with the time period. So first, we'll start off with the 18th century. So looking at Unit 1 from Youth Justice Critical Readings, the main topic is social constructions of youth crime. And the reason why I put this under the 18th century is because that was around the time that this chapter is describing. So in the first chapter that I'd like to go over, Hendrik describes some key themes around the shifting ideas of childhood and how it was really difficult to define childhood at first because before this time period, we didn't have a separate category from youth and adult. And there was a lot of conflicting values between innocence and experience and what different people saw as children and what people saw as adults. And so, another important theme to be aware of is that around this time it was really difficult to define childhood as different classes viewed childhood differently, and it was difficult to universalize across different classes. And as well, juvenile delinquency emerged as a concept around this time. The age of criminal intent changed from 7 to 16, and all of these different, oh, as well as institutionalization was used because of these factors that allowed for us to define a new category of youth. We were able to create institutions to control youth. Um, Following to another chapter by McRobbie and Thornton, they discuss how moral panic really took over society at this time, and how moral panic essentially is the mass culture panicking about a phenomenon. So, for instance, in this case, it was juvenile delinquency and panicking that youth were committing so many crimes and that society and the government had to get youth under control. But the main problem with this is that moral panic shifts attention away from the root problems. And a lot of the time, this could be class inequality or economic instability or just major gaps in different industries and workplaces, and that can lead to poverty and many different ways people treat each other, such as racism or sexism, ableism. All of those things can stem as root problems, but moral panic leads away from those issues. The media also benefits from moral panic and also usually proliferates it. And moral panic is also a form of social control. So moving on, we have a bit of a timeline around the different ways people viewed children. And so the first one was around the end of the 1600s, going into the 1700s, which is the 18th century, was the conception of the natural child. And this was the idea that children were good and pure and had a fresh slate. And also, on the other side of that, they were vulnerable and easily corrupted. And then after that, conceptions of children moved to the idea of a romantic child for a short time. And this was the idea that children were innocent, and as essentially as you get older, you decline as you lose your innocence. And so when you're the youngest and the most innocent you are, that is where, as a child, you would have the most value. And then pretty quickly after that, moving into the start of the 1800s, we had the evangelical child, which was deeply rooted in religious values. And this also benefited the economy, as sending children to Sunday schools or trying to instill in them what was viewed as good values was seen as good for the economy and the future of society. And the main tenets of this view was that children were sinful and would need to redeem themselves, and a lot of this came from religious teachings. And then from there, we had a bit of a shift around the same time, so started the 1800s, from the wage earning children to childhood. So essentially, children were working in factories for very poor wages, and they were not viewed in an equal way to adults. And then this started to shift as people wanted to protect children more, and child labor was viewed as shameful and no longer a norm for society. And another root value that was behind this change was family dynamics shifted. Um, with this was the main concern was essentially that if children were providing for their household, this would shift family dynamics, as the father at that time was viewed as the provider of the family. A couple more things on the wage earning to childhood was that the child labor was starting to be viewed as almost a form of slavery. And as children were starting to be viewed as distinct from adults, this showed the inequality of how children were being treated, especially at very young ages working in factories. And then moving on, we have our first case study. So during the 18th century, there was a group called the Boy Gangs of London. And this is from the Boy Gangs of London article, Go Lapudi 2024. And these boys were known to steal from passerbys and shops during the start of the 18th century. And in 1737, the courthouse saw the collapse of the gang. And essentially, this happened because the receiver, who was an adult named Nicholas Carell, was caught, I believe, purchasing from these young group of boys and enabling their behavior of stealing. And so the Old Bailey Court initiated two trials, one for the gang of young boys and another for Nicholas Carell. Um, in the end, out of the gang of boys, only one of them, named Thomas Chapp, was sentenced to transportation. And Nicholas Carell, who was the adult, who was the receiver for this group of boys, was as convicted as well. I'm not 100% sure what his penalty was. Um, this case was important for a couple reasons. First of all, it brought a lot of attention to the idea of youth crime at that time, as well as how an adult was involved with this young group of boys, and he was seen to have been a bad influence on them. And this could be connected back to the idea of the natural child and how children are viewed to be easily corrupted and vulnerable. And because of this, society was especially harsh on Nicholas Carell and how he was enabling these boys' behavior. Um, Essentially, we know so much about this case now because it was a long time ago, due to a paper called the Old Bailey Proceedings, which today would be similar to our true crime podcasts or documentaries. And a lot of the information in that was likely dramatized, and therefore a lot of this case could not be completely historically accurate. Um, as well, this case, based off of the Old Bailey proceedings, was documented in literature such as Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens and Colonel Jack by Daniel Defoe. And in both of these novels, they discuss similar themes of a group of young boys stealing and wandering throughout the streets. Some other themes that were brought up in the textbook and over the key themes of the chapter are moral panic and how the media, which was the Old Bailey proceedings, benefited from the dramatization and creating a moral panic around the boy gangs in London. And the romantic child was also an aspect that can be seen in this case. So moving on, we have the 19th century. Looking at Unit 2, the origins of youth justice, our key themes are youth becoming their own legal group, and prisons would change to adjust this shift, separating adults from youth in their own prisons. And as well, we have the emergence of the juvenile delinquent category, and we have the perception of youth starting to change around a lot of new laws coming into place to create this legal group officially in law. And as a result of these changes, reformatory schools were introduced. So looking at a couple more perceptions of children, we have the delinquent child, and this was around the mid 19th century, and there was a lot of focus around institutionalization and dependency, and reformatory schools were viewed to be in place of parental roles and having stricter roles on children. The school child was the next category to emerge, which was just essentially introducing mandatory schooling systems for children. And these involved elements of punishment and institutionalization by separating youth from others, as well as separating the idea of wage earning children as a negative now, which before was the norm. Furthermore, after that, this transferred directly into the child study child, which was scientific studies that were conducted usually through schools. This was due to the ability to have a large amount of youth in the same space, and there was a lot more capability to conduct studies around this time. And finally, we have Children of the Nation, which was near the 1880s to 1914, and this was as well as the child study child was during this time frame. And this was looking at the importance that youth provide for the efficiency and how much they contribute to their nation, as well as the future of their nation. And this just furthered the separation of youth from adults. So our next case study during the 19th century, we have the Victorian children, Joseph Lewis, John Greening, and finally an overall list of youth crime. So first off, this is Joseph Lewis, and some important things to think about during this time were the institutionalization of Victorian children and youth crime in general, and as well as the view of delinquent children. Reformatory schools were set up in 1854, and Joseph Lewis had committed simple theft at 11 years old and was charged with 1 month of hard labor. And the next child we have is John Greening, who at 11 years old stole gooseberries and was charged with 1 month hard labor and 5 years in reformatory schools in 1873. And this just shows how the crime at this time could be very minor, but the punishment was often severe, and this was due to the institutionalization and the reinforcement in values of how society wanted youth to act during this time in reformatory schools and other institutions. And then this is just an overview of some more youth and the crimes and the punishments they committed and were told to partake in. And I am just running out of time in this lecture, so I'm going to finish up here, but feel free to look at that on your own if you're interested. I found it really interesting. And finally, the last really important lesson I learned from going over these cases was that you can see the different social constructions of youth start to blur and different views of childhood merging as time goes on, and they all become one very big intertwined conception of how youth should be. Thank you.